This lady is not a politician. She appointed her to speak to the corporate Americans and have the corporate American invest in Kenya to prompt manufacturing and a huge investment, which we really need to demonstrate that America is really our partner. So that is welcome by everyone. The only thing that I would have done if I were Whitman was to go there with a written statement, yes, carefully crafted, carefully checked, word by word, such that, because it was a huge audience, it was a huge devolved audience, where Raila and the rest worked very hard to make sure that is happened. So that did not happen. And so the timing was wrong, and she was too informal going before that group and too unprepared. So that's what happened. No, so we should not continue to dwell on the issue. We should be able to look at the kind of thing that Irungu is talking about. What did we go wrong? How can we correct that? We need to bring Kenyans together. We need to deal with the issue of corruption in this country. Otherwise, there won't be any development. You can say it in different way, but that will not happen.
Right, Ahmed Hashi.
There's another Whitman in the U.S. whom I like better than this Whitman, and he's called Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is probably one of my favorite writers. And you know, he said the truth is simple. If it was complicated, everyone would understand it. Well, Deval, I'm not surprised that Whitman's controversial, just as much as Hashi is. But I think that Raila Odinga is absolutely correct. You know, if Madam Whitman had gone to Radcliffe, not Princeton, she would not have said what she said at the devolution conference. And I think that this wasn't an art of diplomacy. It was an art of the, what was that Chinese guy called Art Sushi, who wrote that Art of War?
Oh, yes.
I think Sun Tzu, that's him. So I think Whitman should refrain from speaking about these things. We in Kenya are desperately torn apart by what is going on in the last election. If the U.S. ambassador wants to help our country, she could help our country by trying to bring the people, the politicians together, maybe for a cup of tea and tell them, you know, there's a better way of doing things. But she should not get involved with the internal affairs of our country. Her president did an attempted coup d'etat in Washington. Donald Trump tried to overthrow the government of the United States. The Kenyan ambassador didn't go up on a podium and say, oh, Trump is, you know, they would have kicked him out of Washington right away. So the double standards, Debal, is quite evident. I think her language was imperial. And since she comes from Massachusetts and Princeton, I'm not surprised because they're a very unilateral way of thinking. And I think Raila Odinga is absolutely right. And remember Rannenberger, the last ambassador, to 2007 when I was a spokesman for the Orange Democratic Movement? He said Kibaki won. And then the undersecretary came here called Jendaya Fraser, repeated the same thing in a table as issues. We kicked her out of the country. We told her we're not going to talk to you. So this is not the first time that the American ambassador has goofed. It is very normal for Americans to goof. It's quite normal, like it's part of their character. So we want to tell Whitman, not the Walt, but Meg, to shut up and not interfere in the internal affairs of our country.
If we may just come to Dr. Hassan Kanenje, we had the Principal Secretary of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Yong'ei Koril, with someone, the head of missions. And at some point also, he talked about the principle of non-interference. If we may just elucidate that, looking at the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, 1961, we can also just go blow by blow to some of the things that are expected from a diplomat or a high commissioner.
Yeah. Well, non-interference is a principle, not just in Vienna Conventions, but even the African Union. They agreed in principle of non-interference. and it still forms part of Kenya's own foreign policy posture. We would not like for other people to interfere in our own affairs. And we've had a history, especially mostly coming from big powers, where they've been perceived to be, doing more than what they are allowed to do, and not just in Kenya but also in much of the global South. And I think the secretary was also speaking to a number of dynamics that have come, of course, in recent years, with regard to some statements made by foreign countries regarding what is happening in Kenya, including the recent mandamanos, which, according to the Kenyan government, that is an internal affair that should not exactly be discussed, by outside countries or by ambassadors. And there is a delicate balance because, sometimes at what point should countries speak to their values with regard to certain things, let's say on human rights and stuff like that. But at the same time, to what extent will that be violating the country's sovereignty, the way they define it in terms of internal affairs and internal jurisdiction. And so, MFA probably was also just reminding, foreign diplomats that when it comes to certain matters, perhaps we should not be commenting. But as I mentioned, it's very, very delicate, especially when it comes to countries in the West, what they consider to be values, and some of the values that, let's say, unite Kenya, or what the common values that we may share, that they think perhaps, we're not living up to. And so it's very delicate because sometimes we don't want to be messed around, or we don't want to be lectured. But at the same time, what happens when there could be aspects where we're falling short, should we not be reminded? Now, what I'm also thinking is that perhaps some of this discussion should happen in private, as opposed to telegraphing them and then publicizing them out there. Then you put, let's say, the government of the day in a place that is a little bit awkward. And so my advice, I think, to some diplomats and especially with Western partners is they should also establish a channel where they can have, direct kind of engagement to communicate some of the concerns they have, as opposed to going out there, because once you go out there, it's less likely that even the government you're addressing is going to actually respond to it, because they will not want to be seen to be responding to external pressure. So sometimes it's counterproductive to approach it that way. However, we have to be alive to the fact that we live within the international community, and we have certain responsibilities at the same time, but also remind those partners that they need also to respect our sovereignty as well as our independence.
Yeah. Can I jump in on this question again?
Could I just go through the article of the Vienna Convention just briefly before? So that, the function of a diplomat or a diplomatic mission consists inter alia in representing the sending state in the receiving state, also protecting the receiving state, the interest of the sending state, of its nationals within the limits permitted by the international law, negotiating with government of the receiving state, ascertaining by all lawful means conditions and development in the receiving state, and reporting thereon to the government of the sending state, promoting friendly relations between the sending state and the receiving state, and developing the economic, cultural, and scientific relations. Nothing in the present convention shall be construed as preventing the performance of consular function by a diplomatic mission. And Article 4 also gives the other side. The sending state must make certain that the agrément, okay. I knew I'll face on your side to correct him. The agrément, this is a diplomatic or a diplotalk. The agrément of the receiving state has been given for the person it proposes to accredit as head of the mission to the state. This receiving state is not obliged to give reasons to the sending state for a refusal of agrément. And it continues, of course, here as well. And I will be going through it much, much later. But let me just hear from you, Irungu Houghton. You wanted to chime in as well.
It's great that you've done this, because I think you've gone to the space that the evangelicals would call, the biblical scripture. Right?
Funny,
this the Vienna Convention, 1961, even before Kenyan independence.
Yeah.
So it is definitely over 60 years of of lifespan. But I think for me, the thing that has always troubled me is just how weak this particular convention is in today's world. You know, let me give an example. 2008, I tracked down the Mozambican ambassador to Kenya, and I asked him, why was the entire world, the entire Western world, speaking about the post-election violence and calling for dialogue between the different parties, but the African diplomatic corps seemed to be nil by mouth? And as the dean of the African Diplomatic Corps, why was he not leading this conversation? He said to me, it was a private conversation, he said, you know, Irungu, if I spoke out, I probably would be on a flight back to Maputo before I'd even finished my sentence. And I said to him, but if you could just simply state the African Union position on the crisis in Kenya, that would help the country. 3 years, I think it's actually a bit further than that, maybe 5 to 7 years later, I got a chance to meet with the former president, Joachim Chissano. And on the back of another conversation, I said to him, you know, I tried to get your ambassador to speak out on the post-election violence as houses were being burnt, people were being macheted. And he told me that he feared you summoning him back to Maputo, you know, because he had spoken out of turn. And the former president said to me, Irungu, it was all in Kiswahili because, as you know, the leadership of Frelimo are very fluent. He said to me, Irungu, you know, to be honest, we would have actually not said anything because it was an AU position. I negotiated that position at the AU summit, and therefore my ambassador is the representative of the president. Right? And I was left thoroughly shocked by this. So that anecdote, in some ways, takes me to another place, which is diplomats today have to be conscious of the fact that diplomacy is public-facing now. You know, it is real time. It is complex because you have different interests listening to you at the same time. You're not scripting a message. And just to be for the record, you know, as Meg Whitman was speaking, there was a PowerPoint behind her that said exactly those words. Kenya had the freest election, da da da. So it's not that she spoke out of tone. That was part of the brief that she was given. Now, I think it's important for ambassadors to be able to speak and to be able to comment on what's happening in other countries, because otherwise, you know, how do we promote global values? How do we sustain a standard, global standard on issues like democracy? But I think you have to take the consequences of what you say. And that's where the skillfulness of diplomacy comes in. Because if it was a speech that was really best placed for San Francisco or California to attract Silicon Valley investors, then I can see that happening. But I think the sensitivity was, it was happening in a context in which you had Kenya Kwanza and Azimio listening to you, and for that matter, the entire country. Right? So I think, you know, going beyond this very tightly scripted diplomatic speech is probably the thing that we have to dismiss, you know, and just if I can end with just a joke and no objection, no offense to diplomats listening to us. You know, they say the definition of a diplomat is that you say one thing with one side of your mouth, and then you say the next thing with the other side of your mouth. The two are completely, you know, opposing views, and somehow you get out without anybody challenging you. And I think, you know, that's not the kind of diplomacy we need to see. We need to see clear-minded, directive policy that actually takes global standards to the next level.
And indeed, of course, they don't speak out of turn. It is well thought through what they're going to say, as you just mentioned. I think that is part also. And you can educate us, especially when it comes to the Foreign Service Academy. Is it also what we take our diplomats through before they go to other missions all over the world?
Well, you know, the almost universal. All foreign diplomats go through Geneva Convention one by one, so that they're all sensitive about it. The problem, they don't follow it. You know, after they leave the room, they're doing other things that are dictated by the moment, what's going on. The issue devolved. There are several forces that are working at present time. One is we're looking at our devolved government and saying, are we making progress? What are the drawbacks? How can we improve from where we are? This is the place where we need unity, unity of purpose. People can have differences. It doesn't matter. Parties come. KANU was as powerful as it was. KANU is gone. Nobody's talking about KANU. Tomorrow, nobody will talk about UDA. It will be gone. There will be another party. That is. We may even lose the South African. We will be gone. But the issue, the ball, is the current world affairs, where Russia, China, the U.S., and the West together. We are in a very tough quagmire. And the countries, Africans, are saying, which way do we go? Do we join with China and Russia and create our own thing? It's, and we all know that's not working. What kind of currency they're going to use, okay? It's not working. Then you're looking at China right now in a real serious economic turmoil, because Chinese economy really heavily depended on the Western economy, US and Europe. And now that America is cutting off and now boosting Mexico and all others, and then looking at opportunity in Africa right now. Can we move our manufacturing base to Africa? So the crafting of the language and how you use it is very important thing right now. And so Meg needed to be sensitive to those issues.
Yeah.
We had a senator from Vermont who is well known in America, who's been heavily involved with Kenyan crisis, who did not get up on the podium and say those kind of things. But he have a sense, and he met everyone. He met the president, he met Odinga, he met everybody, and he report back to the president of the United States. That's what needed to
Let's wind up on that conversation.
It's also good to give some advice to the American ambassador. She should read John Kennedy, the late John Kennedy's appointee to Kenya, who wrote a book called The Reds and the Blacks, which is the basis of our political economy up to today. I highly recommend Madam Whitman to read that book. I think it's still in print, to see the first American ambassador here and what he thought about this country. Secondly, the American version of diplomacy is where, you arrive with a gun on the right hand and a sandwich on the left. The Americans' view of diplomacy is to have a gun on the right hand and a sandwich on the left hand, and they ask you which one you want. They give you a choice. And I don't think that you should choose the gun. Sometimes it's good to choose the sandwich. So I think that Meg Whitman is totally out of order, and I think that she shouldn't do this again. And Mr. Odinga was right. And the pernicious thing is this Kenya Kwanza fellows who, just to for the president to see them on TV supporting this Kenya Kwanza view. It's Kenya Kwanza view and Donald Trump's view is very close to each other. What is the slogan of Donald Trump? Make America great again.
Escape impeachment.
So this guy... so that, and Meg Whitman is a Republican. Do you know that?
Yeah.
She is she's the intellectual part of the Republicans, not the Donald Trump financial market people. So Debal, at the end of the day, Mr. Odinga is right on this and he's on the mark.
So if I could just correct one thing of Ahmed Hashi, and I don't know why you didn't ring that bell. So the book you're referring to is an important book.
Yeah.
It was written by William Atwood, not Kennedy.
No, I said Kennedy's appointee.
Oh, Kennedy's appointee. I just had Kennedy.
I'm not that smart yet.
William Atwood. But my question to Ahmed Hashi, has the book been removed from the list of seditious literature? Because you may be just asking 2 million Kenyans to be arrested.
I think they've...
with the library was that is there as well.
I think they've removed the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte, so it should be out.
And all of the Beijing press publications.
And the little red book.
All right.
I like it.
Now, the African Union Peace and Security Council called on all its members and the international community to refrain from any action that could legitimize the junta in Nigeria It reiterated calls for the coup leaders to release the elected President Mohamed Bazoum. The West African regional grouping ECOWAS has already threatened military action to reinstate him. Nigeria junta has said that civilian rule cannot be restored for 3 years, but this has been dismissed by ECOWAS as unacceptable. And also still on that, the ECOWAS state has rejected a plan by Niger's coup leaders to relinquish power within 3 years. The 3-year transition plan proposed by Niger's military junta was unacceptable. ECOWAS Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security, Abdel Fattah Musa, told a Nigerian television channel on Monday. He's saying the regional bloc ECOWAS insists on the return of constitutional order as quickly as possible, and that the junta proposed the transition plan as a distraction to remain in power for longer. We just want to follow this latest development as far as Niger is concerned. Let's just begin with you, Dr. Hassan Kanenje. Suspending Niger, you think this is the prime solution? Or we begin from there?
No, of course, actions have to be taken, and we do not support as a continent, as popular intellectuals on the continent, any extra-constitutional or unconstitutional changes in government. That should not be allowed, no matter what the circumstances are, because it sets an extremely bad precedent. Now, the question, and want to put it out there, people are asking, in the last 3 years, we've had several coups on the continent, and several coups in the ECOWAS region. Why this one? Why did we not act on the other ones, and now we are picking Niger?
Yep.
Number two, at the beginning of the initial days of the coup, you had some discontent among certain citizens until, I think, as the longer the junta has stayed in place and the framing of the crisis in there as, for instance, France versus the citizens, it has turned the tide of the citizens against the former president. Three, the former president benefited from the previous president, in part because he was also his preferred successor. He ended up winning with 55%. And what a lot of Africans were not paying attention to, at least media, is there was a lot of discontent within Niger at the time that election was stolen in favor of the president's preferred candidate, who came from an Arab minority. Now, these are things we're not discussing. Thirdly, there is a very high, for instance, anti-French sentiment in most of the Sahel region, not just in Niger. So when we deal with this, even as ECOWAS and the African Union, we need to look at what are the root causes, what is happening in this part of the world. You have many of those governments, they've been threatened by insecurity, increased security from terror and militant groups. Many of them are a direct consequence of the collapse of the state of Libya, which again was engineered from the outside. Let's be honest, you see. Two, they're extremely dysfunctional as economies, extremely weak government. Human rights doesn't even exist in a number of those countries. Democracy is a myth. You see. How are we going to expect somehow to turn all this, overnight into something that's actually going to be progressive? So as African countries, especially in ECOWAS, start thinking about intervention, they also need to think very clearly. Remember, 2 countries already in West Africa, among those ECOWAS countries, have actually said any declaration of war on Niger is going to be a declaration of war on them. That means there is a likelihood of regional war. 3 countries ganging up to fight other Africans in there. It's going to be bloody. Niger is a country of 25 million people with a lot of resources in terms of uranium, but one of the poorest countries on earth. Now, Niger is also a country that has been in recent years, most favored country by Western partners. The French are there, of course, the Americans are there, as well as others. But then you have citizens who are not seeing the benefits of this relationship. And so even as we move to blame the rest of the world, or even the Wagnerites and stuff like that. You know, it's not so much because, for instance, of what Wagner could be bringing in those places, or what the Russians bring in those places, because a lot of times they bring nothing. You see, it is so much what has not been happening, or what has been happening that has disadvantaged these populations for so long. Kiambu County probably has a higher GDP than the whole of Niger. You see, this is sad, and Niger is a massive country, and so we also need to reflect as Africans what has been happening. To the extent that we have allowed such practices to take place so many times, you know, we're not going to be seen as being honest with this kind of reactionary attitude today, because the populations in West Africa, especially in the Sahel, is going to attribute that to external factors because of the kind of interest that exists in that dynamic. Whether it's true or not, that is the perception in Niger, and forcibly removing that junta in today may cause the kind of bloodbath that we have not seen on this continent in a very long time.
So I agree with the analysis. I worry about the conclusion.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think you've done it brilliantly in terms of what is the complexity of state instability, absence of democratic and human rights-based rule of law. I think all of that is very clear for me. What I worry about is the message that would be sent to other coup plotters if there is not zero tolerance from ECOWAS and the African Union on this issue. I think the point that needs to be followed also quite closely is around external interference. I mean, we're already seeing tensions between the French and the Russians. We are seeing the Turkish leader also beginning to pitch his views in terms of what should happen. And I think ultimately the other concern really is the extent to which, you know, sadly, our riches, our wealth as Africa continue to be the playground for external parties. And I think your point about uranium is probably the most central point there in terms of the external influence. Why is it that Africa, that produces so much of the world's gold, diamonds and uranium and coltan, which is in all our smartphones, why is it that we are our exchange, the exchange rates between the dollar, which is supposed to be based on the gold standard, and our own currencies at such variance? You know, like if you take a place like Sierra Leone, 5,000 takes 5,000 units of their currency to essentially be up to $1 of the American currency. So I think that's a concern. My deeper concern is really what is the signal that we send, and we have to be conscious of the fact that Afrobarometer, the opinion polling agency, I think it was this year, demonstrated that 38% of Africans are actually steering away from the idea of equality under the law, free expression, freedom of assembly, freedom to dissent, and are gradually moving towards these systems that are essentially perpetuated by people who come to power in their own interests and do not wish to share political power. And I think that's the greater danger, not just for the Sahel region, but for the whole of Africa. And if I can add this in the context of the BRICS conference that's happening in South Africa, for those middle-income countries that are essentially now the repository of the world's population, primarily.
Duval, several points. I think both Kananje and stated the point.
You are about to call me Houston.
Houston.
And Dibal.
I was actually going to Houston. You know, then everything changed.
You can call me Kentucky if you want to.
Go ahead.
No, we need to give you a name that we can.
Let's call him a Rogo.
I'm going to give you all cards now, business cards.
Okay, the point I'm trying to say here, Dubal, is we have a stake in this situation as Africans. The independent movement from early 60s was, Nkrumah, Jamal Abdel Nasser, Unite Africa. Okay, they had the message, but that didn't happen. Nyerere went with the regional. Let's bring the region together. Let's harmonize the region to work. So the question comes, Dubal, who has the best interest of Africa? Irungu talk about the gold, the diamond, all the resources we have, and the country is the poorest of all. Who is the interest of Africa? Dubal, it is high time that we give AU capacity to be able to help Africa settle, or for our best interest. Our best interest does not rely outside the continent of Africa. We can invite other people. The French were here for years. What did they leave? Nothing. Samples. And that is part of the problem, the governors and structures and everything, and the French still interfering, doing everything. So they're no good. You cannot invite them, and they cannot come either the back door, the front door, and say, now we're different, we're going to help you. They said, you need to go. And then we have other foreign powers who are coming in, because there's a vacuum here. And what I'm afraid of is if we don't wrestle this situation, either diplomatically or by force, when it comes down to, if we don't wrestle, then what's going to happen to the rest of Africa? You have Wagner, who are the worst of the worst, the beast. I mean, they have no interest on chicken if you give them. They want what they want. And so we have to keep Wagner out. Wagner boss was in Mali yesterday with a gun. Africans don't need guns. We need thinkers. And we need to create wealth. We need to create food to feed our people. So the time has come for us to figure out how to empower AU so that AU can help us to reinforce civility among our countries.
Ahmed Hashi.
Debal, you know, it's the French who invented the coup d'etat. And the coup d'etat, Debal, in Niger was preceded by something else. It was preceded by a coup d'etat. Coup d'etat is a surprise attack. A coup d'etat is an overthrow of the government. That coup d'etat was made by the French, Debal, because they installed political actors in Niger that sent 80% of their budget to the French central bank.
Yep.
It's just a fact. As I said a while ago, Debal, I think it's in the last show, Niger is the richest country in Africa. The Sahel has got the most resources. And I don't mean the ones under the earth. I mean the people on top of the earth. Forget about even the minerals. Even us here in Kenya and in the rest of Africa, if British colonialism and the empire of the British did not come, the British would be eating potatoes and haddock. There are no carrots over there. No, they got this from the colonies. I think that it's very important for there to be independence in our continent, and that we should end the neo-imperial viceroys that control a majority of our countries, and in many, many ways, even this country. And you know, in Niger, as I said last time, that Niger had universities before the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. Their civilization of Abu Bakr II is the one that discovered the Americas, The learning and the civilizations there, informed the Moors, who whereupon went and captured Spain and spread knowledge all over to England and then all the way to the Plymouth Rock. Civilization started in our continent. And these are just facts. So the political economy of Niger is very simple. It is a colonial backwater for the French, who receive massive amounts of wealth from that country and in the neighboring countries. That's economically. Culturally, they've created mimic men, évolués, people who look and talk, think like Frenchmen, but are not French. The case is very different from my case. You know, I'm from the desert over there. And when they invented the plane in 1914, they bombed us in 1917. We didn't allow those guys to come to our desert. the people of Niger are doing what the people of the Somali Republic did a long time ago. They have rejected this neocolonialism, and I support them in their anti-French sentiments, Debal. And I think that the French have no business to be in Niger. And I think that it is appalling that the ECOWAS has now become an instrument of largesse, where they're taking instructions from Washington, London, and Paris about who to invade. They have no right to invade Niger. And I want to commend the governments of Burkina Faso and the other governments that are going to come to the defense of Niger. There's going to be a bloodbath there between Africans. We don't want it. And who are the people who are who are causing the bloodbath? It's not us, it's in the Western capitals, because of the resources that are in the Sahel. Debal, thirdly, I put it to you that we ought to be very, very clear-eyed about what is happening in our continent. And the Sahel, as I correctly predicted, Debal, is a bellwether about the coming transformation. And I think that between this, none of us here supports a coup d'etat against a democratically elected government, but we also oppose a coup de grace. We oppose it because that's a finishing blow. If these people were being treated in such a way, Debal, the young men and women in there asked one question: why is Niger so rich?
Thank you.
And why are we so poor?
Right. For a few minutes before we take a short break, but we want also to look at the latest from the Global Terrorism Index 2023. And as the world marked the International Day of Remembrance of the victims and tribute to the victims of the terrorism, that was on Monday. A new study reported a 50% increase in deaths last year from militia groups in Africa. The Global Terrorism Index 2023 reports indicates that terrorist attack became more deadly last year, killing on average 1.7 people per attack in the same year, compared to 1.3 deaths per attack in 2021. The Sahel region in sub-Saharan Africa is now the epicenter of terrorism, with the region accounting for more terrorism deaths in 2022 than both South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa combined. The increase in the region has increased by over 2,000% in the last 15 years. According to the Global Terrorism Index 2023 report, the deadliest terrorist groups in the world in 2022 were the Islamic State and its affiliates, followed by Al-Shabaab, that is Balochistan Liberation Army, and Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin. Still on that, the Somali government has offered amnesty to Al-Shabaab militias or militants amid an ongoing military offensive in central parts of the country. The move is seen by some analysts as a way to remove Al-Shabaab fighters from the battlefield, thereby weakening the insurgent groups. The amnesty offer